Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Reading Roundtable. I'm here with Dave Peloff, who has been kind enough to join us on this journey and help us unpack some of these articles. Dave, thanks again for coming back. Really appreciate your time.
Welcome.
And for those of you who might not remember, Dave has taught this class before, and he is with the Center for Teaching with Technology. And we're just thrilled to have him help us understand some of these more complicated documents and work through some of this. So today, what we're going to be talking about is the Moving Learning Games Forward article. And so, Dave, to kind of get into this, the authors identify several different kinds of players. And so can we talk a little bit about what kind of gameplay styles might work for different kinds of players? Because not all players are equal.
Yeah, I really like what they say here, why they even address this topic, because you hear a lot of statistics about how many people play, how many young people in particular play video games. And it's a very high number, both male and female, but very few people ever drill down and say, okay, what kind of gamers are these people? And the fact is, a lot of people are just very much casual gamers. They might pick up their phone, they might play for a couple of minutes while they're in line, somewhere, or if they're sitting, in a waiting room, just waiting, they might pick up their game and play Candy Crush or something.
Yeah.
But how do you even compare someone like that to someone who is really into flight simulators, and plays that for hours every day,
and spends a lot of money on it, right?
Right. Yeah. Or someone who has the virtual reality headsets and gets into those kinds of active gaming. It's one type of game doesn't fit all. And so I think when you're looking at how games and simulations can be applied in educational settings, you have to at least think about that. Who's your audience? Not every video game is going to appeal to every person. My philosophy has always kind of been that you don't necessarily play one game with, let's say you were teaching a class and you thought a video game could be a really powerful tool in the teaching of some engineering concept, let's say. Well, there may be 30% of your class that has no interest in the game at all. They just want to read the book. They want to study. That's how they learn, and that's how they best absorb knowledge. And then they might ask questions. Somebody else may just try to read that book and they just get glazed over and they just can't absorb it. They just get bored to death. But if they play the game and they start building bridges within the game and they start seeing what works and what doesn't, and suddenly those concepts start to hold a little bit more. They're just learning in a different way. So I see that as more like learning styles. It's very much analogous to that in my mind, Gardner's, learning styles. So you've got some students who basically just play when they're bored, others who are really into it. And so one approach might be to pair those types of players together. So you got some that are really active and interested, and they really embrace the whole idea of learning through games, and others who maybe aren't so interested, but they can add to a group experience of playing that game. So he lists 6 different types of games. I think there's a little bit of overlap in those, in my opinion, but it is interesting to at least always think about who the player is and realize that not all games are going to fit all types of people or learners.
And what's interesting is so much in games, there's usually some kind of tactileness to it, right? There's a certain kinesthetic action of either manipulating a control, picking up a piece, moving a card, and that tactile action, that kinesthetic action of holding an object can root that in a certain sense of immediacy in that moment, can't it? When I actually pick up a piece and move it, I'm not just thinking about moving, I actually move it, and there's a certain muscle memory that is generated in that moment that creates almost a kind of a mnemonic, right? I'm sure there's a better word than that, but I'm going to go with a mnemonic right now. That creates a relationship between the thing that they're learning and the physical activity. And in that moment, there might be a neuron that fires in that moment that wouldn't have fired just by reading the document by itself. It's why some people prefer to watch these videos and some people prefer to sit down and just read the articles. You know what I mean?
No, that's a great point. I think in addition to just the action of doing something, the seeing it, the visual
Hmm.
of seeing it happen, also creates a different pathway. I was
Hmm.
thinking of the game Portal, in terms of geometry and spatial reasoning, and those are concepts that are very difficult to teach. But in a game like Portal, you actually are acting out. You're creating puzzles, or playing someone else's puzzles, but you're seeing how space and density and weight and size and perspective, how all of these things look to your eyes.
Hmm.
So that goes into a different part of the brain than if you
Hmm.
had tried to just read it.
Yep. And it's interesting because, one thing I think that's important to think about also in tuning a game, and we're going to talk about this a little bit about in the, kind of tuning the aspects of a game so it works well for the players. But one of the things that's interesting is that there can be different kinds of linear structures to it. So when I read something, I start at page 1, I go to page 2, I go to page 3, and then through that, the narrative unfolds, or the tale or the point unfolds that the author is trying to make. In games, we have the ability to do nonlinear structures where we can basically, especially with more open world games that are very popular these days, that I can do the missions whatever order I choose to take them in. And that way I decide for myself what order and what's important.
Yeah.
And in that, a person has agency that they can move through that as they will, as opposed to having kind of once again, procedural almost way of having to move from step to step to step to step.
Mhm.
And I decide what's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great point.
So, it's interesting. One of the things they talk about, and I think this, this kind of caught my eye on page 8, and they're talking about the Nintendo DS. So again, some of our students might not know the Nintendo DS, but when it came out, it kind of did mark this revolution in network gaming. And for many students, they've only lived in a time of network games where the expectation, what I mean, there are gaming cafes that exist, and you and I are a little older, and so we might remember a time before games were not networked, and maybe you can help us unpack what that experience was like for you, even going from this world of just kind of playing a game in your, on your console, to suddenly having this wide world of interactivity open up.
Well, I would say two things come to mind. One is that games are inherently social activities, usually. I would say throughout most of history, games have been played in groups or with other people. And that's such a big part of the experience. I know with the DS in particular, my daughters, who are now 21 and 23, but they got the DS when it first came out. And one of the first things they did was start playing Mario Kart with their friends. And I watched how they were never really gamers before. I would play games and they would watch me play. Sometimes they would watch me play the PlayStation, but they didn't really want to play. They just sort of wanted to watch. But as soon as it was a social experience and they're playing with their friends, it was a totally different thing. Now, the other thing that comes to mind is this whole idea of online networked gaming,
Yes.
which is very different than, you're all sitting in the room together with a DS.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some really amazing things that happened when they studied, I think initially it was World of Warcraft, started looking at how these total strangers were playing these games together and creating this whole cultural world. Some of it was really positive. You hear a lot about the negative aspects of it sometimes, the online bullying, and that definitely exists. But there's also this cooperative play that exposed a whole lot of people who might have been alone to other groups of people who have similar interests, who really enjoyed doing these kinds of RPG strategy games, but didn't have anybody to play with. So suddenly they're online, they're interacting, they're learning how to work in groups, they're learning how to communicate, they're learning how to take on a role within a team. You know, it's all these things that you hope to teach kids in various ways, and this is, you know, networked gaming did it, even though that wasn't the initial purpose. So those are two things that come to mind on that for me.
You're absolutely right. And it's interesting because I can't help but think back to Jane McGonigal a little bit when she talks a little bit about the inherent positivity of what happens when a community like that can work together to solve a big problem.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening so much in these games, is that, you know, you might be fighting another team or trying to build something or take something down, or whatever your activity is, you're working cooperatively. And, you know, you don't survive well, you don't do well if one person just kind of surges ahead and everybody else kind of just you know, is not really sure what to do. When it works well is when people start working cohesively. And that, again, going back to that Jane McGonigal concept of what can happen when you have a community kind of rising up, and even in the serious game model, about what can kind of the positive work that can come out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one quick story is,
please.
I don't remember where I heard this, but there's some story, a teacher was talking about how some kid in their class was, you know, was a quiet kid, never said anything, never really participated. They had a conference with the teacher, and they find out that this kid is actually, you know, running like a 30-person World of Warcraft guild at home, you know, with people who are, you know, who's leading these group efforts, you know, everybody's looking, and he's like, you know, 12 years old. So you just, in that example, you know, you're exposing someone to something that allows them to use their skills and to grow in a way that they wouldn't have had any other chance to before. Now, that might be a Pollyannish kind of example, but it was real. It really happened for at least one person. So
right. Well, and that's where it comes back again. You know, we talked before in another recording about BOGOS, but that comes back to procedural rhetoric. What, as the game designer, do you interject if you give people the option to have weapons and to fight, and that's the procedural rhetoric of what you're running along is to fight and kill? Well, that's what you're going to get out of the experience. You know what I mean? You get out of what you put into it. But if you put in some kind of inherent problem solving, now we're talking about something different.
Yeah.